is Alan Freeman, who is very well known as a rather controversial interpreter of Marx, but less well known, and I don't know why, because he deserves to be extremely well known for this, as someone who has worked in the GLA for many years on the subject of the creative industries. So I thought that as he's floating through London for 2 days between Istanbul and Canada, where he now lives, it would be good to snaffle him for this this meeting and get him to talk about austerity. I said austerity in yards, which has a much better ring to it. But he says austerity in the creative industries, and I'm told there's a big story behind the choice of these, which we may or may not hear. But Alan, austerity and creative industries.
I'm very pleased. I will try and explain why I picked the subject of the creative industries. A little bit of the explanation might lie with my work at the Greater London Authority and what has subsequently happened, because at the Greater London Authority I basically held 2 briefs, apart from economic forecasting, which we can discuss. One was for the living wage and the other was for the creative industries. And early in that I produced a document called London's Core Business, which was at the request of the Mayor's Office, and it investigated the role of the creative industries in London. And we found a number of things. One is a number which I have since decided was wrong, but which everybody uses when they're talking about London, including when they were promoting the Olympics, which is 1 in every 5 Londoners is working in the creative industries. 1 in every 5 Londoners is working in the creative industries. And the second thing we discovered is that it was what I called a benign productivity revolution. Now, in 2002, we still hadn't mentally recovered from Margaret Thatcher. I mean, in fact, we still haven't now. But productivity revolutions were in people's minds synonymous with losing jobs. This was a productivity revolution which was absorbing and creating jobs. And I thought that was an absolutely exceptional thing, and it interested me greatly. And I began to ask, why is it that something is creating more value and employing more people? And my preliminary conclusion was that it's because of the kind of people that it employs. So I began to investigate the way that the creative industries function, and I came up with an index which is called the Intensity or Creative Intensity Index. And this is the only technical part of the whole presentation, I promise you, Vicky, that the intensity of creative employment in any given industry is the percentage of the workforce of that industry who are creatively occupied.
Not creative in...
Occupied. In other words, they are doing creative jobs. The distinction here is quite an important one. Not everybody who works in a school is a teacher. Teaching is the occupation. School is the industry. A school employs many people, janitors, service people, administrators, technicians, and you may be surprised to know that the percentage of people who work in education who are teachers is less than 40%. And in fact, the percentage of almost any profession that is occupied as you might expect is generally speaking lower than 20%. The percentage of construction workers in the building industry is, I think, and don't quote me on this, 15%. The percentage of electricians in the electricity industry is about 10%. In the creative industries, the percentage of creative workers is on average 50%, and in many industries as high as 80%. So this is actually an extraordinary economic phenomenon. And I then began to develop the thesis that the creative industries were in fact a modern industry. because I was challenged by many people who said this is not a true industry. We know what is an industry. An industry is manufacturing. An industry is agriculture. An industry is banking. And I went and looked, being a sort of techie sort of guy, at the definitions of an industry. And if you go to the manuals, I'm probably the only person who ever reads them, it actually says an industry is defined by having a special input, a special process, and a special output. So I said, well, if it's an industry, I've already discovered, or we have already discovered what special input is. It's creative workers. Not a thing. Very important, this. It's a human input. What's the activity and what's the output? Well, the first thing we began to look at was the output. And I'm just now going to move to the next slide, which is entitled, What are the creative industries? This is the segmentation that we are now working on, and I should actually, before I introduce this, segue to another part of the history, which is that other people became interested in the same idea at the same time. One of these groups of people was a team of people working in Australia in a place called the Queensland University of Technology. And the Queensland University of Technology essentially contained the people who coined the godfather of the term creative industries. There was a document that came out in 1997 called Creative Nation, an Australian document. An Australian development policy was very much focused on creativity, and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, under Chris Smith, a visionary whose record is greatly understated and underestimated, but who was responsible in many ways for the whole idea, took this on board, and we had, I think it was actually in the run-up to the election, the idea of the creative industries were going to be the sort of technological revolution of the future. And so the DCMS came up with its definition of creative industries, originally based on the ideas of the Australian team. They carried on working, just as I did, and Nesta, National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, became interested in what we were doing. And they coincided in this idea that the intensity of employment really tells us something interesting about that industry. So these numbers come from a report that we are now working on with Nesta, in which we're not only looking at the creative industries, but we're also looking at so-called STEM industries, science, technology, engineering and medicine. Or mathematics, depending on your point of view. The most interesting thing is that the STEM industries are also one of these industries that are like teaching. High-tech industries don't employ scientists. 20%, 30%, still quite a high proportion, but nothing like as high as creative industries, and it doesn't single them out. One of the interesting things about intensity is if you want to know which industry is creative, check its intensity. It tells you everything you need to know. There are about only 2 tiny industries that were in the original DCMS classification that don't have this high intensity. The average intensity of employment of creative workers in the creative industries is 25 times higher than in the rest of the economy. You can actually see that in the column down the right, which is the intensity of employment in each of those sectors of the creative industry. So there you see those extraordinary numbers. 75% in music, performing and visual arts, 65% film, TV. The lowest is 43%, advertising and marketing. But in the rest of the world, 3%. That's a huge difference.
Yes.
You don't see that with STEM. It's an important thing, but it's not the only thing, and it's nothing like such a discriminator as creativity. But that's where this comes from. Now, I should fill in one last part of history, and then I'm done on the history. We did a previous report called A Dynamic Mapping of the UK's Economies. This was part of an exercise, although I must be very careful to get this absolutely correct. It was an independent exercise conducted at the same time that DCMS was carrying out a new study because they're changing their classification of the creative industries. And they're still in consultation, but obviously there was a lot of interest in the method of intensity. and the concept that intensity is a guide to how you classify them. And I very much hope, although it's still not decided, that the government will actually adopt this as the method. It's certainly quite likely internationally to be accepted as the method. So we're not talking, when we talk about the creative industries, about a bright idea of Alan Freeman. We're talking about a quite widely accepted, fairly authoritative concept. A lot of discussion, a lot of difference, a lot of argument about what they consist of. So we do agree that they exist. We do agree that they're very big users of a particular human resource. And we do believe that they're growing very fast, particularly in Britain, but not only in Britain, and that the growth appears to be employment creating rather than employment destroying. Okay. A couple more facts. This here shows you the regional distribution of employment in the creative industries. And the right-hand column shows you one of the very odd things about it, which is they're very highly concentrated in London. I think that was one of the things which actually was an obstacle to them being more widely taken up, because people felt this is just a London thing. But, and this is breaking news, let me turn you to the right-hand chart. That's the rate at which, this figure here is the share of your workforce which is in the creative economy. So that 15% there is actually the corrected 1 in 5. It's closer to 1 in 6 London. Between 1 in 6 and 1 in 7 Londoners are in the creative economy. Still much higher than elsewhere, and there's a sort of penumbra around what we call the greater southeast. So after London you get the southeast, the east of England and the southwest, which are all the surrounding areas of London. So there's a big London effect. But here is the rate at which that's changing. Look at London. London is actually losing not creative workers, but the share of its workforce which is creative. It's becoming proportionately less creative. Where is it growing? Well, it's growing around the greater southeast, but look at this, northeast, 21% in 10 years. Yorks and Humber, 18%. East Midlands, 12%. There is evidence that either there is a ripple effect, or, and we don't know, because it could be that everything else is declining except the creative industries. But that's still an important message, even if it's the case, because that means there's a sustainability there. It's not a flash in the pan. It's something real. And it employs, by the way, the overall figure here is a useful one, 2.5 million people. It's a pretty big proportion of the UK workforce. There are not many industries that employ, as an industry, that proportion of the UK workforce. I think finance, health possibly, and business services, maybe a couple of others. That's to some extent an accident of the classification system, of course. If you put together a bunch of industries and make a big industry, you're going to show up a bigger scale. But I think it's a fair comparison with the existing industries, and I would defend that. All right, that's the numbers and the technical stuff over. Now we'll go on to the fun stuff. What's it all about? Our inquiry began where the DCMS didn't pay much attention, which is we said, if this has got a special type of labour, what does that labour do? What does that labour do? And the conclusion I came to, my very concise definition of the creative capacity of a human being, is it's that part of labour which cannot be mechanised, cannot be made repetitive. What the creative industries actually sell is what is sometimes called aesthetic content. You buy something and what matters to you is not what it does, not that, let's say, the kettle boils water, but that it's a nice kettle and it looks pleasant. Maybe it even makes the water taste nicer, I don't know. And there's been a change gradually moving through many traditional sectors of production whereby the aesthetic content has gradually become the main thing that sells what you're producing. I had a very interesting discussion with two completely different people. One was a football shirt manufacturer and the other was a car manufacturer. No, it was a car fan. The car fan pointed out, Tony Stoneman, he's a guy who wrote Soft Innovation and that stuff. He said, about 2000, or maybe a little bit earlier, when they were advertising a new model Jaguar every year, they stopped saying it's got a new engine and they started saying it's got a new bonnet. In other words, they were selling the car on the looks, not what was underneath. Very subtle shift, but a very important one. The football shirt manufacturer, I'll never forget this, made football shirts for Liverpool. And he said, because there was a big discussion about which part of the fashion industry is creative. People are saying T-shirt industry, Bangladesh, millions saying not creative, right? High fashion, catwalk, that's creative. And at that time, there was an attempt to distinguish high from low fashion, which I resisted at the GLA. And now I actually was on the team that oversaw the British Fashion Council's recent value of industry, which was, I think it was not this room, but it was welcome. It was piped in by Ed Vasey, so it has the seal of approval. And they've changed their mind now. Everything's fashion. But it really is. It reflects a real change. And this guy told me, he said, well, 15 years ago, we outsourced every single football shirt. We sold them for £3 each. So we now sell them for £25, and we do all the sewing ourselves. Because the football teams change their strip every year, and the kids want the football strip. And what they want is the look and feel of that. It has to be top quality gear. And you can't get that with mass labour. And he said, I know that because the wages I'm paying are going up and up and up, because the skill of that labour that produces those is getting higher and higher. That sort of process is going on. And a quick summary of what I think these industries do, this is an economist's definition, is they sell differentiation. They sell difference. They cater for a specific bunch of people who want this object. My favourite example here is Zara. Zara is phenomenal. They will send somebody to a catwalk show. They will sketch who is on the catwalk with whatever dress. They will send it overnight back, and their designers will turn that into a dress which is in the shops within 2 days. And they will be printing it in 5 years' time. They'll make 300 of them, and they'll have a line outside the shop. I want the dress that Naomi Campbell was wearing on the catwalk 3 days ago. They sell differentiation. It's not, I don't want any old red dress, I want that red dress that identifies me with that person. And that you can see across the board. Look at the buildings that dot London's skyline and compare them with the nameless, identical piece under, concrete blocks that used to dominate the skyline. Each one has to be different. Now, the creative labourer is the person who understands the audience and turns what they think the audience want into a particular version of a product that would otherwise be a mass product. That's what the creative is. That's why you can't replace that labourer with a machine. But that overturns one of the fundamental precepts of economics, the substitutability of labour and capital. How many undergraduates go and get, first of all, a minute's exposure to some general micro text where everything is substituted, and then they get the capital labour model. That's what they get. K and L, one for the other. So that doesn't work anymore. The resource is not something that can be substituted for labour. It is labour. But there's a second consequence, that what you do does not depend on things anymore. Because the bulk of what goes on in those industries is mental activity. Yes, you do use a lot of resources, and there's a big movement within the creative industries which is very seriously discussing how you reduce the consumption of resources, the museum culture, the big rock tour, all that kind of thing. The very fact that they're thinking about it is because they know that they can do it. Because if your main input and if your main increase in value comes from increasing the spiritual, mental, creative activity of human beings, you are intrinsically not dependent on using more and more resources in order to get what you're doing. So you can have growth without resource consumption in this industry. Very important consequence, one I think has not yet been absorbed. So people haven't caught up with this. Now, how are we doing for time? All right.
Fine.
Quick facts about services. I promised no more facts, but unfortunately I'm going to give you some. I'd forgotten that. The left-hand graph is a graph of the proportion of various economies who work in the service sector. Service is an extreme. Sector is a misnomer. They just do services. Now we have to be clear what services are. Driving a train is a service. So the fact that you were serving a Mac is a service. But the fact that you drive a train is different from making an object. I mean, with the Mac, it's intermediate. Do you make a Mac? Is it a manufactured object? I don't know. But the bulk of what you do is serve the damn Mac, all right? It's not mental versus manual. Service labour can be extremely boring and repetitive. Not saying service labour is creative. What we are saying is that the majority of people, because the right-hand side of that graph tells you that I think it's 86% of US workers are working in the service industries, people are no longer producing things. And this has huge consequences for conventional thinking about economics, because this whole focus on STEM, in mind, I'm not against the focus on STEM, but it's tied up with the notion that we have to revive the manufacturing economy. I've got news for you. The manufacturing economy is not going to revive. This is a historic change, exactly similar to the decline of agricultural employment. We will still need manufactured things, just as we still need food stuff that comes from the land. But the labour that is required to produce that is diminishing down to nothing. The productivity revolutions that have driven, in terms of labour productivity, that have driven successive industrial revolutions have exhausted themselves. I actually believe that it's, in a fundamental sense, a new stage of history when we can no longer grow. God knows what we'll do instead, but we can no longer grow by producing things more and more efficiently. It's absolutely fundamental consequences for the way people think. And the right-hand graph is China, just so you don't think this is developed versus underdeveloped. Manufacturing employment in China is declining. The fastest growing employment sector in China is service labour, which is now 50% of the economy. Just, sort of shakes up the way we think. Now, this is from a wonderful book by a man called Moretti, and I have to thank Hassan Bakshi and Nesta for drawing my attention to this, called The New Geography of Jobs. Everybody should read it. Absolutely everybody. It's a fundamental book about what's going on in the USA, and he begins with a comparison of the effects of Hurricane Katrina and industrial decline. And he goes through the industrial towns of the USA, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and he looks at the loss, not just in employment, but in population. Detroit's population has gone down by 25%. Now, Yorkshire towns were hit badly, but I don't know of any Yorkshire town that has lost 25% of its people, not just its industrial workforce, all right? And that's at the same level as Katrina, which completely destroyed a town, drove most of the people out of it. So this is very fundamental. And at the bottom, he's showing you, I completely lied about not giving you more facts. There's lots more facts, but they're interesting and fun facts, unlike the first lot of facts that I gave you. 372,000 manufacturing jobs every year since 1985, inexorably downwards. That's the chart on the right. Not just in manufacturing. It's not traditional versus new, because I put in there computer manufacturing, which went up till 1990, is now in decline. Semiconductor manufacturing, which went up till 2000, is showing signs of decline. Not even sure that that's outsourcing. You just don't need so many people to make a computer anymore. You don't need so many people to make... It's the rise in productivity that's driving those numbers, in my opinion. Okay, and you can look, on this chart, I can't point to it with the mouse, but right on the left, at the bottom, down from 22 million to 12 million over 25 years. That's a historical trend. It's not... You'll never get it back. So what are you going to do? Well, here's where jobs are growing. This is what Moretti calls smart jobs. Now, smart jobs, in my opinion, combine creative jobs and science jobs. They're just jobs where you have to think, where you need a qualification, and that qualification is employed, because you can get a qualification and serve Macs. Right? There's a difference between qualification and occupation. If you're in an occupation that uses your brain, basically, that's what a smart job is. And again, internet employment, that's a phenomenal rise. I mean, up to 2,500,000. Scientific R&D, not rising, but not so fast. Pharmaceutical, not so fast. Software, rising up to 1,700,000. So that's 1.7 million. So actually, between software and the internet, scientific, between those categories, they've almost made up the loss of manufacturing. So there is life after the death of manufacturing. Here's where it is, the use of humans who put their brains to work. So what should we invest in them? What's it got to do with austerity? Well, first of all, these are not dark satanic mills. Now, I am going to talk about some of the problems with the creative industries, because all is not wonderful there, and I'm not saying, but I think the reason that it's not wonderful isn't because they're creative industries, but because of the way a market-oriented economy uses them. That's the argument. The problem is not with creative industry. The problem is with them being solely under the management of the private sector. That's the problem. However, you don't go in and come out devastated and destroyed and, die at the age of 40 as factory workers did when the Industrial Revolution started. Some of the things that you do in a creative industry are actually pretty damn pleasant, to be quite frank, especially if you're creatively employed and not just a hanger-on. They create jobs by growing, as I've already said. They enhance human potential. You're extending the range of human capacities, the many-sidedness of humans. I'll later deal with the argument that this is purely frivolous. I don't think it is purely frivolous. I think it's a genuine extension of human capability. And that's what we're here on the planet for. I shall stop so it's not recorded. How long does that go on for? You have to leave now.
No, it's an end of play.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Not wonderful, it's a great job you're doing. You should do it all night.
We need a bill ringer, and that's more employment, yes.
There's nowhere else to grow. This is the 14% versus 76%. When I talk with the science policy people, they're always on the search for the next best scientific innovation, nanotech or materials that will transform the way we live. And I said, well, it may transform the way we live, but it's damn well not going to transform the way we work. Because if it's only 14% of employment, even if you double employment in it, you're not going to make up for the jobs you're losing out of manufacturing. It may change some aspects of the quality of life. That's very important, but it's not going to deal with the economy. It's not going to deal with humans. It's not going to deal with employment. So there is nowhere else to grow. I think stagnation will continue until we start investing in these industries, and I don't think that they will. I think there are limits to what they can do on their own. That's the fundamental reason, which I'll come on to, as to why we actually need to invest in them and why it needs to be a state and government policy to invest in them as opposed to just cheerleading them. All right. And it's a branch of the economy can be both economic and ethical at the same time. Now, since, I don't know when, there's not been many industries of which it's always been the choice, make money and kill people but benefit the world eventually. Or the Wall Street, that greed is good, well, the whole point is the greed is doing harm. But here you've got an area where I'm not saying greed does good, but I'm saying you can actually grow, you can create more wealth, you can extend human capability at the same time. That's why we should invest in them. Now, here's the arguments against. One, perhaps the most important in my opinion, because I think it's something where people who are not on the same side should be on the same side. It's not destructive of the planet, and I think that we've got to really do some work because there's practical things, it's not just mental. There's real difficulties, huge discussions with people in the resource decoupling world, which is a very important area of green economics in my opinion, about whether growth is inherently destructive. I don't think growth is inherently destructive. I think that if you can grow by enhancing mental and spiritual activity and human activity, you can at the same time decrease your consumption of resources, and I think you actually have to. You have to do both. The two work together. They don't have to be separate, and they shouldn't be. Second argument, culture is a frivolous luxury. It's, I heard a presentation last week from a guy from Johannesburg, and he pointed out that the National Art Gallery of Johannesburg is right next to one of the biggest slums in South Africa. And the main sign outside it is, "This is not a public urinal." Great way of branding an art gallery. The number of people who go to it is 50,000, of whom he told me 25,000 had to go anyway because their schools sent them. So it's nobody. So when you have that degree of separation between the enjoyment of the arts and real life, of course you're going to, this is a complete waste of money from the point of view of those million people in those slums whose main issue is simply to get electricity, water and education and food. So it's got teeth, this argument that it's a frivolous luxury. I'm not going to deny there's a problem, but I think there's a way of overcoming that. Then there's the idea which I think is widespread. It's most clearly expressed, I think, by Larry Elliott in Fantasy Island, that creative industries are not really producers in the same way as manufacturing are. It's imaginary. I think that comes by making a false identity between finance and the creative industries. I think there's a big difference. I don't think the banks do create wealth, personally. I mean, I'm not going to make an issue of this in this meeting, but if people say it's just like the banks, you're just, pretending to make money, I don't think that's the case. But the argument is that it's pretend money, it's not real money. And then the last argument, one of the most powerful, and I think very important in terms of what we do about austerity, is the Hayek argument. We should not pick winners. If they're doing so well, why do we need to invest in them? They'll do it themselves. The market's taking care of it. Actually, I think that's the most powerful and important argument to deal with. Anyway, against the arguments against, I've already put the point about growth. It's only destructive when it consumes and makes things. You can resource decouple, you can reduce the use of resources at the same time that you can grow human capacity. Now, as regards culture, I think it's absolutely tragic that we have created a world in which the enjoyment of art and culture and what are called the high things of life have been seen as the privileges of an elite. It's a tragedy, because the capacity to enjoy wonderful life and beautiful things is inherent in all of us. And I have two wonderful examples of this. I mean, the first is bread and roses. It's not just bread, it's roses. But the second is something that my partner, Radhika Desai, brought to my attention. She said that in history, whenever there have been bread riots or corn riots, everybody points it out, but there have also been onion riots. At the same time. Why? Because onion adds flavour to food.
Because?
Onion adds flavour to food. So people have actually rioted because the food does not have aesthetic quality. From the very people who have absolutely nothing. You only have to look at the way that colour figures in the lives of extremely poor communities to understand that the enjoyment of beauty is a fundamental aspect of the human condition. So I think that we should actually, if it is now something that is enjoyed only by an elite, turn that round and say it's the birthright of humans, and it's not a privilege of the rich, it's something that everybody should be able to enjoy equally. And a fantastic, amazing world it would be if we could attain that, by the way. Just imagine if everybody had the artistic appreciation and capabilities, which is innate in them, of, the art critics, perhaps more discernment, but, the capabilities, shall we, the knowledge of what art is really about. If it's a fantasy, then why do people make money out of it? You see, if the creative industries are making money but not producing value, they must be stealing the money from somewhere else. They must be. Somebody's giving, maybe the manufacturers are really making it and they're stealing it off the manufacturers. This is analogous with a version of economics, a bit of theory here, which some of you may have heard of, called physiocracy. Physiocratic theory said that all wealth is created by land, and the towns are merely an idle froth who reprocess, but they're not productive, the wealth that comes from the land. The more that the humans migrate to the cities, the more absurd that idea is. And what's behind it is a confusion, here's my Marxism, of use value and exchange value, or value, because they're confusing the value, which is a human creation, with the things themselves. The value does not reside in the things. The value resides in what we do with the things. Now, I have this word which Radhika and I, my partner, have coined, that now what we have is a machinocratic fallacy, analogous with physiocracy. People think all value comes from machines, the K. What do you do when you can't substitute K for L? You say, well, it's really the machines that make the value, and the L are stealing it. So the creative industries are stealing value from the machines. You've only got to say it in that form to realise how wrong it really is in a very fundamental sense. It's you're looking at the world upside down. You're looking at the machines instead of the people. And the minute you find a thing that people do that you can't replace with the machine, you realise how dumb it is. So, now, next, picking winners. And this is the thing I think that economists against austerity have really got to get to grips with, because this underlies the free trade mentality. If you have an industry that's powered by humans, what is the single most stupid thing you can do? Is deprive humans of what they need to function creatively. Take away their food, take away their welfare, take away their well-being, take away their education. It's like standing in front of a Victorian train with a red flag. There's a new technology here, it's called human creativity. And you're saying, in order to save the economy, we've got to stop it in case it grows too much. And too many of these, hoi polloi become capable of understanding what art's about. Oh no, we can't have that. It's rich. We understand what art's about. The people who pay the 30% tax, the 1%. They're the ones who really understand art. The rest of you shouldn't know about it. So the austerity is completely the wrong policy. You actually have to massively extend the participation of humans in what at present only a small number of people do. Secondly, the issue is not winners, and Hayek is often, I think, misused very fundamentally because he elides, well no, he's wrong, he elides the concept of doing better than anybody else with the concept of being optimal. The fact that you're doing better than anybody else doesn't mean you're doing the best that you can do. You could be doing much worse. It's the implicit assumption of economics that if you're doing better, you're competitive, you must be doing the best. Not true. We could do far more with the creative industries than is actually being done by the astonishing but meagre performance of the creative industries to date. Third, it's a whole economy problem. It is the difficulty with the creative industries growing is that the whole economy is not growing. But actually, you need the creative industries to grow in order to grow the whole economy. So the market, let's put it the other way around, the assumption of the picking winners argument is the market is solving things. But systemically the market, there's a systemic market failure. There may or may not be market failures in the creative industries. I'm going to look at that in a minute. Even if there weren't, even if they work perfectly. Because it's a systemic market failure, you need to grow the creative industries as fast as possible to solve the systemic problems of the economy as a whole. That's the thing that's going to drive it. Just as, unfortunately, but it's true, the growth of the car after the war, the growth of the steam train, the growth of all these wonderful machinocratic things, drove the Industrial Revolution, the age of steam, the age of coal, the age of oil, and so on. It's the fastest growing industries that get the whole economy out of the mess. That's why you've got to invest in them, even if they're doing well. Even if there was no market failure whatsoever, you would still have to invest in them to solve the problems of the economy as a whole. Fourth, what I think is, alluded to this, there's actually a transition needed to a new form of growth. And when you do that, what happens is something that previously only elite enjoyed, like travelling in a Mercedes-Benz. Well, it's still the elite, but it was the only car when Benz invented it, right? There was only one car and it was driven by him and his wife. It becomes something that always when you get a big revolution, Fordism, what was Fordism? Everybody having a car instead of just some. We want, the creative industry is the equivalent of Fordism. Everybody having access to art. That's what we want. Okay, and that's a vast scale of transition. This is the last point. One can completely underestimate the scale of what's needed. Between Benz and the motor age, there's a transition from 0.001% of the population owning cars to 80% of the population owning cars. All right, that's the scale of what's needed. All right, what does investing in civilization mean? My little Venn diagram. I love this. I always insist on a very important distinction between space and place. Creative activity takes place in cities. Undoubtedly, investment in cities is one of the most important things you have to do to get your creative industries going. But that is not just building concrete. You build the spaces, but what you pay attention to is what people are going to do in those spaces. So it's having the culture, basically allowing your cultural needs to determine the way that you build things. You build things in order that people can enjoy them, see their beauty, take part in it, interact with each other, because it's interaction which is fundamental to the process of creation, which I didn't mention. Part of the process of creation is collaborative interaction between humans. You have to encourage the international nature of it, precisely because it thrives on difference. So if it thrives on difference, you're going to maximise the expansion of human experience by maximising the human experiences that feed into it. You only have to think about things like Bhangra and fusion cooking to understand that it's the interaction of cultural influences which drives creative expansion. So it has to be international. And the cities are the nexus where this happens. I coined the phrase, I think somebody else coined it, but I grabbed it, I can't remember. I subconsciously plagiarised the notion that cities are creative factories. I think it was Innes, maybe Jacobs, not sure. Creative factories. It's the city as a whole that functions as a factory. You can't build a creative building. I've been to so many places where people say, we're going to put this building up and it's going to do creativity, and the first floor is going to do arts, and the second floor is going to do crafts, and the third floor is going to do music, and the fourth floor is going to do public relations. And it doesn't work like that, right? All the creatives worth their salt will avoid going into such a building because they don't like being confined and, organised in that way. All right, on the last straight. Human development, which is what you need to do to invest in civilization in these industries, does have material preconditions. So this is not about gross national happiness. This is not about let's all put on thongs and contemplate and we'll get mental progress. Because in order to create, you need to have a certain stage of material well-being and education. You need time to think. You need education. You need to have spent time simply being educated, which has certain material prerequisites, such as schools, for example. You need to be able to travel to work in a time which doesn't mean you're doing nothing but commute. So you can't have a creative economy where everybody's scrabbling to live. It's not going to work. You have to actually, as I put it, create affordable places to interact. So actually, housing, transport and environment, all those fundamental human services that get the creatives together in the city, are a fundamental I start from housing and education when I'm thinking of how you invest, which means buildings. Strange after everything I've said, but those buildings are the prerequisite of the creative economy. Then what do? Then you actually start to think about people. This is where I get most speculative. But I think we have to start thinking about education much more seriously and much more differently than we have done whatsoever. I went to a meeting where, I can't remember where it was, I think it was Estelle Morris, I'm not sure, there was the Secretary of Education at the time, Labour Secretary, and we're pushing earnestly at this meeting to get higher education up to 49% of the population. I said, what's magic about 49%? You want it to be a minority. What's wrong with 51%? Why can't the majority of people, why can't 60, 70, 80, 90%? Why can't university be like school? And if you look at the way that civilization has advanced through successive stages in every country actually, but particularly European is what we know about, what has always advanced is the age at which you leave education. So the Victorians got it up to 11, abolished, the drive to abolish child labour was actually very fundamental in many. Why stop children working? Because you want them to grow. You want them to be able to think. It's not just, because even in the Victorian age, an intelligent workforce was becoming a prerequisite of industrial production. Then when you get to Beveridge, it goes up to 15, and all the huge progress we've made since Beveridge is pushed up by 1 year to 16. But de facto, 17 or 18 is becoming a sort of minimum level of attainment. Right? I think 21 should be the minimum. I see no reason we shouldn't say every human being will go to some form of self-development, and it doesn't have to be a university. It can be ballet school, art school, a technical school, whatever. Specialism is part of the way you develop diversity. The more specialisations that you've got, the more diversity you're going to have, because the more people with different specialisms you're going to have interacting, right? So we have to generalise the concept of HE, but we basically have to do a lot more of it. If you do that, then there's a number of very important economic consequences. You see, education is fundamentally counter-cyclical. It not only continues, people continue education when you get a downturn, people actually turn to education. I haven't got a job. I'm going to go to school. Well, we shouldn't just regard that as a cop-out. We should say, damn good. So, simple measure, instead of work fair, let's have self-development fair. All right? You're not working, okay, just prove that you're going to, for a year, a course that is developing your capacity as a human being, and we'll pay you for it. What are we doing instead? Taking people's grants away. I mean, it is just so nuts. I don't know. People will look back on this in 50 years, if there are any people around in 50 years, and they'll say, this was surely one of the most stupid ideas that anybody ever came up with. They'll look at it like the red flag in front of the train. They will. So it's highly counter-cyclical. We should encourage it. And they're also community institutions. You see, part of what any community now has, it has a hospital and it has a school. All right? And it has a park. Those are the three things. Winnipeg's very interesting because when they decided to become a city, the first decision they took in 1905 was to plant trees. Because that proves they weren't just a Wild West brothel town. We don't just have sidewalks, we have trees. And they actually handed their boulevards over to the Parks Department, which I think was the most amazing. And we now, 100 years later, when you fly over Winnipeg, you can't see it because it's covered in trees, called the Emerald Carpet. And I use that in my presentations at the Mayor's Luncheon in Winnipeg and say, we're now planting artists. And in 50 years' time, you'll be grateful because you won't be able to see the concrete for the art. We want it to be like that, okay? So they're community institutions. They transform the nature of a community. Schools are everywhere. Hospitals are everywhere, thank God. Not everywhere in some countries. Parks are everywhere. All right. We want universities to be everywhere. And then every town will have, every village even will have a centre of learning. It transforms the nature. You only have to think what university towns are like, how fundamentally different they are from towns which just make things, to understand how important universities are. Imagine if they were as widespread as schools. Very last, there is a dark side. Actually, I had a copy of the Evening Standard, which had a report today, which I thought was very illustrative. Little short thing. It just said, half the people in the advertising industry reported being bullied. There is an extraordinary degree of, here we go, see if I can find it, extraordinary degree of hierarchy in the creative industries. Something that Andy Pratt at formerly King's College, now City, has done a lot to uncover. Hidden hierarchy, hidden discrimination that goes on. Here we are. Bullying rife in glamour industries. The arts, entertainment and media are hotspots of bullying, says the report. A survey of 4,000 workers, including screenwriters and performers, revealed that more than half had been bullied, discriminated against or harassed. The study, commissioned by the Federation of Entertainment Unions, showed shocking levels of ill treatment, hand in hand with a culture of silence. Bullying in the newspaper sector was exceptionally high. Celebrity internalisation. People are told you ought to be glad for working for nothing. I've actually had museum sector workers, highly trained, PhD people with the knowledge of the arts you wouldn't believe, being told the reason we're giving you £17,000 a year is because you're getting £10,000 worth of enjoyment. People get told that. That is the museum culture, unfortunately. Not all the more enlightened people think of it differently. It's very rife. Okay, and when you get to advertising, I mean, people work for nothing for years in order to get on the ladder, a ladder that they'll never get to the top of. There's abuse of power. I think we're entering an age of new. You've heard of Rob Ford in this country, haven't you? He's been on the news, right? My God. Okay, he's the criminal mayor of Toronto. I can say that. That's legal. He's admitted. He's confessed to crime. He's actually confessed to buying substances. Completely lunatic. Maybe that's a slander, but never mind. New Age of Force, universalisation of criminalism in government. Berlusconi. The extraordinary thing about it is it's got to the point now where people don't just say, my God, he's a criminal. People, I believe, actually vote for people because they're criminals. Because they think they're likely to fix things that, a lot of, the sort of Arturo Ui crowd basically say the government is, destroyed our lives, they're getting away with everything, we'd rather have one of ours in power. And I think that's a big part of it. You neglect this at your peril, because Rob Ford believes that he will be re-elected. Now, he may have gone too far for that, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Poll rating went up.
Pardon?
His poll rating went up at first.
Poll rating goes up. The amazing thing is the satisfaction ratings go down, and the number of people who said they're going to vote for him go up. Right? And Berlusconi comes back again and again and again, right? So there is this sort of criminalisation of government, which is coupled with the second thing, and it's to do with celebrisation. People vote for somebody as the representative of something, which is celebrity. And, actors being elected as presidents was the first phase of all that stuff. Schwarzenegger, Reagan, and so on. To a certain extent, I won't say, but I am in London. We live in a society of universal deceit. The sort of explosion of one thing after another, Manning, Snowden, Assange, Vanunu, just highlights something. The deceit has become a completely accepted part of what you do. And the media are part of that. Just look at the way the newspapers have changed. Berlusconi, media empire, the hold that Murdoch had on people. The newspapers, more than they used to be, exist to tell people what to think instead of tell people what's happening. People do not go to the newspapers for news now, unless you've, from the sort of literati who read the play, who know what to look for, as it were. People, I don't know, they read them the way that people used to read comics. I don't know exactly, but they get a line from them, and the spin has become, and the media and the creative, the way modern culture works, plays a big role on that. So, how do you combat that? Well, one reaction, which I think is absolutely wrong, is we have to regulate it. There are some things that do have to be regulated. I don't think that criminals should run the country or the cities. I don't think that it's good that the media do what they do. But the fundamental thing that's wrong is the underlying culture. If you have a culture which venerates inequality, which venerates greed for greed's sake, which lauds somebody who is successful in abusing and bullying all the people underneath them, then you get it happening. You have to change. You have to have a different culture. You have a culture which is based on equality, on respect for the environment, on the right to care. That's the realm of public values. That's why we need government. That's a public issue. But you cannot change it just by pontificating about it. You can't say, we think people should be more equal, but we're not going to do anything about it. You can't say, we should respect the environment, but we're not going to spend anything on green technology. You should have the right to education, but we're going to make you into a debt slave for all your life. You can't do that. It's a material thing. You have to transform the culture by transforming the underlying society. So you bring a new culture into existence. It's a really mammoth task. It's not a quick fix task. So I have this notion that there are now universal rights of the new additions to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The right to create, the right to care, and the right to sustain, which have to be added. And I finish with this quote from Keynes, which Vicky pointed out to me, which I think is amazing. In 1937, he said this. Maybe I should read it out. We destroy the beauty of the countryside because the unappropriated splendours of nature have no economic value. We are capable of shutting off the sun and the stars because they do not pay a dividend. London is one of the richest cities in the history of civilization, but it cannot, quote, afford the highest standards of achievement of which its own living citizens are capable, because they do not pay. If I had the power today, I should surely set out to endow our capital cities with all the appurtenances of art and civilization, on the highest standards of which the citizens of each were individually capable. Convinced that what I could create, I could afford, believing the money thus spent would not only be better than any dole, but would make unnecessary any dole. So here we are, 70 years later. I think it's time to implement Keynes' manifesto. Thank you for listening.
Very good.